Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fan fiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
All I'm saying is that we shouldn't go directly to the Platinum Dragon Lord immediately after finding this out. Ever since the twins had left the room, the atmosphere between the three friends had gradually been growing more and more. What once started as a calm exchange of ideas had now become something of an intense debate due to the differences in the opinions of the members. Though each shared the same goal, the way they went about reaching that goal differed based on their personalities. This was not new, however, as the same arguments took place almost daily whenever a guild assignment was set. Everyone would have differing opinions on how to handle certain quests. This was simply a natural part of being in a guild. Therefore, even though Ainz saw these two frenemies clash their ideals into each other in the form of their spat, he said nothing. This had occurred many times back in Yggdrasil, and thus the best way to end it would be to wait for both sides to give their arguments, then reach a consensus when they were exhausted. Plus, when the others get back, we can just get their opinions as well. However, whether they would agree with one of the sides' point or only bring in another side in this battle remained to be seen. Why not Touch-san? We're clearly much stronger than him, and we have the numbers on our side. What's 190-ish magic tank to all of Nazarick? I think you've forgotten that our opponent has world-class items at their disposal. Even if he was level 10, someone wielding World Savior could decimate all of us. So why are you being so rash about this when we have so little information? Come on, how likely is it that they can use the equivalent of World Savior? I'm saying to be cautious precisely because we don't know that. As both sides refused to back down, Ainz continued to merely observe. Frankly, if given the choice, he would side with Touch Me on being more cautious to their opponent as opposed to going in guns blazing. Though he understood where Albert was coming from, there were still a huge amount of unknown variables at play. For starters, it was still unclear on what limits there were to wild magic. They hardly knew what it was at all other than the fact that it could rival world-class items. But that wasn't to say they were completely in the dark either. From Pandora's actor's mock battle with him, they had gotten a general outline of his capabilities, and it would seem he was of no threat if one were to only factor in his combative abilities. It would seem that he was roughly on par with an unenhanced Doomlord. Therefore, if one disregarded his magic, he would be a rather paltry opponent. Yet when potentially so much of his panoply was unknown, it was hard for Ainz to give the green light. Not to mention he was a member of the Council State. If the information we have been given is correct, then that potentially means we could be dealing with 5 or even 7 Dragon Lords on his level. That being the case, we should move forward assuming the worst-case scenario of them having enough power to rival even the strongest of the world-class items. It was always better to prepare for something and have it not be true than to be caught by surprise after all. Even if they only possessed as much power as the current Dragon Lord that they knew of, the only thing they would lose is time. Well, we should wait for the others before anything is definitively stated. I don't want to force my... What do you think, Momonga-san? Should we attack him now while they still don't expect it? HM? Ah. So it's my turn now? Honestly. Though he was preparing himself to give his side as he knew he would be called upon eventually, they had still managed to catch him unawares. Well, if you want my thoughts, then I don't think either of you are wrong, but I find myself mostly agreeing with Touch-san. After hearing his declaration, Albert merely turned his head to the side to show his reluctance. Touch Me, on the other hand, seemed to be emanating an aura of superiority. Even with his helmet and insect face, anyone could see the smug smile that was directed towards Albert. That said, I don't think you're entirely wrong, Albert. It's true that we could more than likely overwhelm him with our numbers and strength, but I don't want to agree with such methods when we still lack so much information. Their full capabilities, their numbers, and even their items. Believe me, I want to attack them as much as you, maybe even more so, but we can't just charge in and risk losing everything. I don't want the Shaltir incident to repeat itself. especially not when it's them. While it was bad enough to have one of his friend's children taken, what would happen if they themselves found themselves being taken? If one of them ends up mind-controlled and they were forced to kill them, what then? If they were unable to be revived, then how would he cope? No, that won't happen. It would simply be impossible for them to achieve that. He would not let them. He would design as many countermeasures as needed. Besides, we still need to wait for Buku Buku Chagama-san and Peroroncino-san to come back before we can truly reach a consensus on this. It would be best for us to simply wait before we make any rash decisions. Of course, Momanga-san, we wouldn't act without them, as we're all equals, we're just trying to reach an understanding before then. Speaking of them, I wonder when they'll be back. Should I message them and tell them to join us? No, Albert-san, we should give them time to chat and bond with their own creations. I doubt you would have wanted to pull you away from your chat with Demiurge, right? Yeah, I see your point. Well, until then, let's just postpone this debate and just talk until they arrive. I'd really like to know how you all felt about the NPCs. Around an hour had passed before the room's entrance finally opened, revealing Peroroncino, who had finally finished with his meeting with Sheltier. His posture did not give off the impression of someone who was upset or disappointed, so Ainz could at least gather things had gone well. Ah, so you're finally here, Peroroncino-san. So how was it? Honestly, she was better than I expected. It was almost like I was just talking to the female version of myself. While it wasn't what I was expecting, I can safely say, she is without a doubt a top-tier waifu. I see. Well, now that you're here, do you know when Chagama-san will be? We've postponed our plans for the future until everyone is here to agree to them. We're deciding on whether we should attack the Platinum Dragon Lord or not. It would seem Albert was rather eager to move on with their next fight. Ainz had always figured that if he was brought here with him, he would be the battle maniac type. And it would seem that his guess may be proven correct. I had messaged her when I left. She should be here in a few minutes. Saying so, he took his seat at the meeting table and leaned back into his chair. Well, it's not like we can't come to a consensus before then. We had tried that earlier, but then decided it was best to wait for everyone to be here. Right now we're deciding between attacking now or holding off. Well, if you want my opinion, then I would say we should attack now. It would get the main threat out of the way quickly, right? You get it. Albert was quick to support his new comrade in arms. Now that he had backup, he was going to aid him with all his strength to form a stronger argument, leaving Ainz with the impression that this was not going to end quickly. Sigh, leave it to the two attackers to be the most impulsive about this. I'm telling you that we should gather more info in order to make sure we don't get slaughtered. Isn't that how we did things in Yggdrasil? That was your way, Touch-san. That ended when Momanga-san took charge, which is why we do these votes. You. Alright, enough you two, we need to keep things civil. Ainz could sense the change from harmless debate to a heated argument, and quickly quashed it. His words seemed to act as a cold bucket of water to them, as they immediately apologized to him. I'm sorry, Momanga-san, I shouldn't have brought that up. I apologize for getting a bit too heated in my argument. You don't need to apologize, just try to avoid arguing over this stuff until Chagama-san is here. What do I need to be here for? Almost as if on cue, the slime set foot into the meeting of friends, signaling the true start of the debate. Ah, good. Now that you're here, Chagama-san, we can begin planning our next move. Though before that, I have to ask. How do you feel about the twins? This was the answer that Ainz had been wondering about the most. He truly wanted her to be able to reciprocate the love they felt for her. I was right all along. Boy, girls truly are precious. Looks like she's seen the light. I told you there was nothing to worry about, Chagama-san. They basically are just normal children. Oi, One-ichan. Weren't you the one 5 minutes ago saying you felt guilty about forcing that on them? What's with the sudden shift? Well, let's leave talk like that for another time. Now that we're all here, we can finally begin to discuss what our plans are going to be. Right now we are trying to decide between attacking them immediately, or observing them and attacking later. What is your opinion, Chagama-san? Wouldn't the latter be the most obvious choice? We would want to make sure that we have a chance before we attack. Right. Well, now both sides are equal, so we should be able to agree on something now. With the final member's opinion on the matter being given, the sides were now set. Albert and Pero both wanted to strike immediately. Touch Me and Chagama wanted to observe. And Ainz was left as the neutral party. Well, when both of our sides are so black and white, how can we agree to anything without completely changing sides? Well, majority vote is how we usually handle things anyway, but I do understand what you mean. What about you, Mamanga-san? You've been here the longest, so can you think of any other ideas? Frankly speaking, even though he had been here years before anyone else, almost everything that had occurred was too advanced for him to understand, or 90% of the details were hidden from him under the assumption that he knew them already. It would not be inaccurate to say he was just as lost as when he first came here. Come on, there has to be something that could work here. Think. What did I do specifically that applied in the kingdoms we conquered? Memory after memory flew through his head in his attempt to pinpoint a situation where albedo or demiurge had not been a part of, but none seemed applicable to his current predicament. The only time I actually did something of my own accord was when I cast. Oh. Well, if you're asking me, then why don't we formally declare war on them? If we did that, we could stall at the front lines and use the opportunity to observe their abilities. That sounds like a decent enough idea. Almost like a mixture of both sides. But then we would need to focus all our efforts on the country instead of the individual. Providing, of course, the other counselors aren't already together. Ainz partially agreed with Buku Chagama on this. Though he had been the one to bring the idea up, he didn't have full confidence that it would be the right one to go with. Do you think we should intimidate them like I had done with the kingdom? When I had used my super tier spells on the kingdom, it killed over 100,000 people, which caused their morale to plummet to rock bottom. Maybe we could do the same thing there, and that would cause them to lose the will to fight. After that it would be simple. This idea was not without benefits. As that war proved, intimidation was a very useful tactic in war. Even more so when you outclassed your opponent so heavily that they could not even imagine you losing. While the idea is good, I don't know how I feel about slaughtering 100,000 people to prove a point. Touch Me was the first to object to this idea. Though he had no qualms about killing those who deserved it, deaths that could be avoided were another matter entirely. I agree, Touch-san. Killing 100,000 people wouldn't be a good idea. The entire room instantly focused their gazes on the source of this agreement. To the unilateral surprise of everyone, it was actually Albert who found himself agreeing with him. This was almost unheard of. Really? I would have thought that you would have. Killing the same amount as before wouldn't cause that much panic anymore. We need to use a spell that will kill at least double that amount. That will really teach them not to mess with us. And there it is. That was the sole thought running through everyone's mind. You're just looking for an excuse to use Grand Catastrophe, aren't you? Buku Chagama was able to discern his intentions in the blink of an eye. It would seem that her experience with her brother had trained her in these matters. It would accomplish our goal of creating fear in the enemy, right? We're just speaking in hypotheticals right now anyway. We wouldn't go to such drastic means without proper justification or reason. Though Ainz did not care if they did or didn't, it would be best to hold off. As long as there were people who disliked the idea, going through with it would create friction between them. Then what options are left? The way I see it, they've only left us the one. We will be forced to attack them sooner or later, so wouldn't it be best for us to finish it up as quickly as possible? The room collectively gathered their thoughts to reflect on his statement. What would be the better option? On one hand, they may be able to accomplish their goals quicker if they set out to fight immediately, but they would have a lack of info and possible lose due to an unforeseen battle. The other path would be to gather info and then attack, which would greatly improve their success rate. But then they would risk losing to enemy countermeasures, and if they really were the assailant who brainwashed Sheltier, one of them may be caught unaware and controlled. Both sides had merits, and neither was truly wrong, but it felt like something was missing. What if we just did nothing at all? The room could not help but give confusing looks towards Buku Buku Chagama for those uttered words. How is doing nothing going to help us? Well, since a war took place recently, it's more than likely that the nations who are against us will be planning to attack us by surprise. That being the case, we should stay idle for now in Nazareth, all the while gaining information on the other countries with spies. That way we could gather information on them, and deal with them accordingly. We can turn their surprise attack into our advantage. Everyone simply stared in silence. It was a good plan with no real demerits. Though it was shocking that such an idea could have come from her, as this was by no means her area of expertise. Leave it to the tank to provide the best defensive argument. That shouldn't pose any problems and might work quite well, Chagama-san. That almost sounds like something Punito Mo would say. Touch Me's words spoke for the group. I remembered something from one of our conversations, and I just applied it to our current situation. I mean, why risk our lives on something that hasn't been 100% confirmed? I guess you're right, but wouldn't that take a long time to accomplish? Albert-san, there is no need to rush things when we are talking about our actual lives. Plus we technically represent the Sorcerer Kingdom, so we may be condemned for our aggression seeing as the rest of the world is unaware of the friction between Nazareth and them. Though the kingdom was secondary to Ainz, it was currently the only way that he and his friends could be in peace, since it was showing to the world that coexistence was possible. Choosing to be too violent could ruin all the reputation he had built so far, which may force their hand. I understand, Mamanga-san, I kind of just want the threats to be cleared out so I can do as I wish, but you're right. It's rather selfish. Then are we all in agreement to Chagama-san's suggestion? Yep. I'm fine with it. Sounds good. With a unanimity finally being reached, they could now move forward with the next phase of their non-existent plan. All right. Then that will be our plan moving forward. We will send doppelgangers to the other countries in order to gain intel on the enemy's thoughts. If something notable happens, then we act on it. But until then, Nazareth will simply go back to hiding in the shadows. We can also possibly use them as bait. If the enemy bites, then we will be ready to strike back. Until then, continue as you were, and hone your skills for the battle that will surely take place. Once Ainz's rallying speech had concluded, the entire group nodded as one to show they understood. Their resolutions firm. A young man walked through the halls of the great tomb of Nazareth's 9th floor. Nothing about his face or cloths would make him stand out, as he could only be described as average, or mildly handsome at best. His hair was a light blonde and appeared to be quite shaggy, though still well kept. His eyes were a very deep blue, and one may almost mistake it for black if the light levels were different. His face was youthful, and one could say it suited his age. Fully 100 out of 100 people would agree that he was just a normal human if they saw him. However, the small pair of bat wings that stuck out from his back told a different story. It told his true nature as clear as day. He was a demon. However, other than this fact, there was nothing remarkable about him. Especially when considering the fact that heteromorphic races were the overwhelming majority of the population, he would be even more innocuous. Yet it was for precisely this reason that he was so noticeable, as any and every humanoid within the tomb possessed levels of beauty that were unattainable by mankind, as well as clothing that not even the richest of nobles could even begin to afford. Naturally, this would draw the gazes of any other denizen. Of course, they would only be filled with either mild confusion upon seeing him, or the far more common emotion, contempt. After all, this was the inviolable sanctum of the Supreme Ones. Seeing someone who was not created by them. Roaming in its walls so casually would naturally draw the ire of any who would dare call themselves servants to them. The target of this anger, Climb, did not particularly care about this, however. He had endured this same abuse from many nobles and maids alike back in the capital. This was no different from then, so he simply paid them no mind. While he was curious as to what he had done, he ultimately decided it didn't matter. As far as he was concerned, there was only one person whose opinion of him he would take to heart. Renner-sama. After being forced to kill her own father by the Sorcerer King, as well as witness the fall of the kingdom that she so deeply cherished, her heart must have been going through unimaginable sorrow. Therefore, all he could do was stay with her in this place to keep her company. As he thought about the events of the past few weeks, the words of an old friend came to mind. Climb, don't forsake your humanity in pursuit of power. I'm sorry, Evil Eye-sama, but I will follow the princess to the ends of the earth. When she appeared above him on that bed, looking so distraught, how could he possibly have refused her? Compared to what the princess has been through, my suffering is nothing. I need to make sure she stays happy while we are kept here in this prison. Though he spoke ill, as it was the abode of the one who had caused all this, in truth it was only a prison in name only. This was the same place that everyone else occupied, therefore it possessed architecture, cuisine, and technology that was far beyond anything the kingdom, no, the entire world was able to offer. It was only considered a prison due to the fact that they were not allowed to leave. Despite this though, he could not say that he was not enjoying the wonders of this land. Especially. He shook his head to clear the blush that was surely forming upon remembering his mistress's curvaceous body. No matter what Nazarick had to offer him, it was all dirt in the face of finally being able to receive his mistress's love. Yet even when immersed in this heaven, he could not forget the forms of those who were closest to him. Almost everyone he could call a friend in the kingdom was now either slaughtered or unavailable to him at the moment. Both Gazef and Lockmire had been slayed on the Katsa Plains, and Brain's whereabouts were unknown to him. However, knowing him, he most likely made a last stand against the advancing army and was killed. However, whenever these thoughts came up, one question always plagued him. That being the current condition of the butler known as Seabass. I can't possibly imagine him losing, even to the incredible armies of the Sorcerer King. But then what could have happened? Was he one of the many who fled the kingdom, or was he able to fend off the approaching army? Even though Climb was hopeful, he was not completely naive. It was almost certainly the former. If he really had taken a stand against him, then perhaps the kingdom would not have fallen, and they would not be in the situation that they were in now. Though he had to stop himself from thinking like this. If he continued, it may very well be considered treason. While I may not agree with his actions, I have to pledge my loyalty to the Sorcerer King now. If Renner-sama is willing to do so, then I will follow her to the end. That being said, while he would obey any order that was given to him by her, he could not completely abolish the doubt in his heart. He was now loyal to the terrifying being that had stolen everything. And while it was true that he had sworn his fealty, it was also true that he had no real choice in the matter. It was almost impossible for genuine loyalty to be born under these circumstances. He often found himself nowadays feeling conflicted, unsure of whether his thoughts were right or wrong, with no clear answer in sight. Perhaps he would never truly find one. He chose to rest on one of the many chairs within the Great Hall of Decadence. Just like everything else here, it was of exemplary quality, and he sunk into it the moment his flesh touched it. Who would have thought we would meet again like this, Kleinkuhn? His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by an all-too-familiar voice. His head jerked behind him only to find the smiling form of Seabass. How? Seabass-sama. How are you here? What? Such was his surprise that his mind was unable to even form words. He was under the impression that he would never see him again. Once I had heard that you were now being held within Nazarick, I felt obligated to come and see you. How have you been faring within its walls? Though he was happy to see a familiar face, the oddity of the situation was causing him to feel rather unnerved. He did not even know where this place was located, or for that matter, if it was even within the same world at all. For all he knew, this place inhabited another realm entirely. That being the case, how could he have reached him all the way here? There was only one conclusion his mind could come to in the moment. Please wait, Seabass-sama. Before that, may how you are here? Did the Sorcerer King offer you a role by his side due to your strength? He could at least bring himself to understand that much. Seabass was strong. The strongest being Climb had ever fought, as a matter of fact. Though he had only had to bear the man's killing intent, it was more than enough to teach Climb that he occupied a height he could never reach. Only the Sorcerer King could compare in terms of presence. However, Seabass's next words completely shattered that idea, as his next statement blew any semblance of calm Climb had managed to retain. What are you saying, Climb-kun? I have always been loyal under Ainz-sama. The voice was said naturally and gently, completely at odds with the comment's impact. The meaning of those words slowly dug into Climb's soul. But, you, since when? As I have just stated, Climb-kun, I have always served under the Supreme Beings. My presence in the capital was also under their orders. But why? The Sorcerer King destroyed the entire kingdom and slayed millions of lives. Aren't you at least a little upset by that? A slight twitch was seen on the usually stoic butler's face, which caused Climb to subconsciously back off. It would seem that he had said something he shouldn't. Though almost as quickly as it came, his features quickly returned to normal and the anger in the air vanished as if it had never been. Though the cold sweat on his hand proved it was no illusion. Climb-kun, I would advise not speaking ill of Ainz-sama within these walls. He is the head of all of the Supreme Beings. Therefore, whatever decision he makes is surely the correct one. We only exist to carry out his will. Anything less than that would be considered treasonous. He said his last line with noticeably more force, the reason not needing to be stated. My apologies, Seabass-sama, I didn't mean to go against His Majesty in any way, it's hard to simply forgive how much death was caused by him. I understand that I must serve him now, and I have no intention of changing that, but I can't get rid of the doubts that weigh in my heart. Seabass-sama, aren't you at all upset over those that died? Though Climb had already asked this, he chose to reword his question, as the last one was, in hindsight, a bit accusatory. This may be hard for you to understand, Climb-kun, but we who were created by the Supreme Ones do not see life and death in the same way as those on the outside. All beings in Nazarick, barring myself and a few other exceptions, see any being that was not created by one of the Supreme Beings as inferior. Therefore it does not matter to us what happens to anyone. If the Supreme Ones will it, then it is our duty to obey. If they so choose, I would slay you here without hesitation. Though it was but an example, Climb's hairs rose on end when he heard that chilling line. Therefore the destruction of the kingdom is of no consequence to us. All that matters is whether it was able to help Nazarick. And as I understand it, the kingdom brought it upon themselves, did they not? He tried to answer, but no words came out. It seemed like he knew the answer, but his brain was rejecting it. It would seem that you are not yet convinced. Climb-kun, though they may commit acts that you may consider evil, the Supreme Ones are not heinous beings. In fact, they are all immensely compassionate figures that we truly don't deserve. My creator, in fact, Touch-me-sama, is known as the strongest warrior, and some would say he is justice and righteousness personified. By creator, do you mean your parents? After hearing this, Seabass descended into a small period of introspection before responding. It would not be wrong to refer to them as such, but that is not what I am talking about, Climb-kun. The Supreme Beings are the gods that rule over all of Nazarick. Keeping in line with their titles, they have sole domain over the powers of life and death. As such, they created all the denizens of this place, and even Nazarick itself from nothing. The Sorcerer King is a god? But how is that possible? Even if you can't believe it, it is simple objective fact. All of Nazarick worships the 41 Supreme Beings as our gods, so any one of them can tell you all you need to know about them if you are having doubts. I would suggest you do so, as not all of Nazareth is so forgiving to hear one's loyalty come into question. Though he had heard all that Seabass had to say, he did not seem to be convinced. I understand how you feel, Seabass-sama, and my views have certainly changed based on what you've told me, but knowing that he had an entire kingdom destroyed for one noble's actions still seems excessive to me. He looked to the ground, knowing that his opinion was not going to be well received. Though he only noticed it for a moment, it would seem that Seabass's mouth had opened slightly, then closed immediately after. Were you going to say something, Seabass-sama? They stared at each other for several seconds before any movement was made. Though it sounded squeezed out, he finally managed to say something. Climb Kuan. There you are, climb. Before he could finish, however, a voice had interrupted by a sweet and innocent voice. Once which he could never forget. The owner of it grabbed onto his shoulder and greeted him with a warm and beaming smile. Even though she was now a demon, that did not seem to hinder her in the slightest, as Climb could not even picture an angel whose smile was as endearing as hers. I was looking all over for you, Climb. I was going to go to the canteen and get something to eat, but I was feeling lonely, so I wanted you to come with me. Her face was the epitome of a pouting face, one which completely sapped any will Climb had to resist. I'm sorry, Renner-sama, I just got caught up talking to an old friend. I am sorry, Seabass-sama, but can we continue our conversation another day? That is completely fine, Climb-kun. I also have my own task to accomplish as well. Thank you, Seabass-sama. Then Renner-sama. Let's go. As he turned away, the ring on his finger glinted in the light, which unknowingly caught the attention of Seabass. As Climb's form receded into the distance, Seabass could not help but feel a slight bit of pity for the boy. Though both parties loved each other, he knew that the princess was hiding her true self from him. And while he wanted to tell him of her true nature, and that she was the one who had come up with the plot to destroy the kingdom in the first place, he could not. Though he may not even care, seeing how much she meant to him, that was not the problem. Renner was an invaluable asset to Nazareth, and though they would be forced to obey any order given, things may go south if Seabass ignored their wishes and acted on his own again. He did not wish to cause his master any more issues from his own selfishness once more, so he kept his mouth shut. As he left to continue his work, however, his mind suddenly went to the ring he saw on Climb's finger. Though he was not adept at reading the magical power of items, he could sense something from that ring that felt strange to him. It gave off an aura that seemed to be unique to it, and though it was most likely not valuable, he kept it in the back of his mind. If the topic ever comes up, I'll simply inform Ainz-sama. I'm certain he will be able to understand what that ring is given his knowledge. Life is precious. What was once such a common phrase that everyone in the world could agree on was now thrown to the wayside in the current age. Throughout the slow passing of time, certain laws and restrictions began to become obsolete as the power dynamic of the world slowly shifted from leaders of countries to the leaders of businesses. In the early 21st century, things were still for the most part normal. Though some things could be influenced by having enough money thrown someone's way, people were able to live in whatever way they saw fit, and jobs were still normal and treated people fairly. However, by the middle of the time period, power began to shift away from the leaders of the world as companies that the world depended on grew in scope. Essential services such as the internet were practically impossible to live without, and as technology grew, so did the people who provided it. Though life continued on as normal, certain policies were phased out in an effort to grow at a faster pace. Though this did cause a noticeable increase in workplace accidents and deaths, the first true VR systems had come out around this time, which was most people focused on, and caused more important news to falter for a bit. Perhaps things may have been different had this not been the case. By the century's end, however, it was too late. Companies had grown too powerful to stop, as even if governments stepped in, they could not do much due to how integral certain technologies became, so even a minor misstep would have massive economical cost. Because of this, they became leaders in name only, as most jobs that were not automated was under those corporations. And most people will tell you that this was the point where society turned into what it is now, and when the corporations that now ran things gained the title of mega. Now in the year of 2138, death was hardly a rare thing. People's corpses were scattered along the sides of roads, as homelessness was practically a death sentence due to the deadly miasma that filled the air. And even those that did have shelter were not much better off, since most jobs were extremely hazardous to work in. Unless you had managed to get lucky and make it to high school, you would most likely be forced to put your life on the line to simply earn a living. Mining for resources, constructing skyscrapers, and even jobs as mundane as working on an assembly line were only but a few examples. Though they were the most common, as many required precision. While they were dangerous, the megacorporations knew that people could not simply choose not to work, which gave the perfect opportunity to remove policies. Things like healthcare and the like were phased out, with the excuse being that so many people are injured on the job nowadays, and the economy would collapse if everyone received treatment by the state. The most controversial, however, was child labor. Due to the dangerous nature of the jobs that needed to be done, people vehemently defended against this for quite a while, but eventually were forced to concede after bills were just too high for most people to pay on their own. As a result, the number of workplace-related deaths increased by a fairly noticeable margin, and due to the nature of the companies, very little money was paid to the grieving families, such was their callous disregard for their lives. Many had suffered greatly under them, but it was far too late to do anything about it. This was, and continues to be, the new status quo. And no one was exempt from this. A door was thrown open with alarming amount of force. The noise of the door hitting the wall behind it was the first thing to break the dead silence of the house. Yet after the initial slam, the dead air once again took root. Though one may find the sound of emptiness in their home to be pleasing, as it signified nobody had entered while you were away, the face of the man whom had just walked in seemed to fall slightly, giving off a rather depressing air. The house itself seemed to be quite well of, a rare commodity to most in this age. Everything was cleanly sorted out, and each object was sorted to fit in a set place, so nothing felt out of place, and would make it extremely easy for one to find what they needed. Though when one looked closer, it almost bordered on obsession. Things that did not even need to be sorted were arranged neatly and crisp, such as silverware and other utensils. While strange, it was not a true issue, and it really caused no problems, so it could only be described as off-putting at the very most. The owner of this house was known to his friends in Yggdrasil as Genjiro, and was responsible for the organization of the guild's magic items and other such objects. He considered himself well suited for the role, as he suffered from OCD, and therefore did not mind tidying up the giant pile of wealth that was the treasury. Of course, even this had its limits. Though he sorted weapons, data crystals, armor, and the like into their own distinct categories, even he could not begin to organize the true bulk of their treasure. The various trinkets that laid in their vault were simply too numerous and possessed too many categories to be able to sort them accordingly. After setting his work cloths aside and grabbing a drink, he simply sat down with a loud sigh. Well, there goes another day down the drain. Once again the same as always. Though he seemed to be a rather sad individual, this was not always the case. Even now he was still a well-meaning person to be around, but he had become more secluded even since his had lost the one closest to him. A long time ago, he had been walking home when he decided to talk with one of the many orphans on the street. There was no greater meaning to it, he must just trying to be kind as he killed time while waiting for this bus. Yet the encounters continued more after that, until it became a daily occurrence. Eventually they got along so well he took her in to stay with him. They only grew closer after that, and he even began to see her as his daughter. Something to cheer up his otherwise bland life. That was, until she died. Like most children her age, she was able to start working now that she had a valid address. However, the conditions were far worse than what she expected, and as a result, one day she had perished. Hearing this completely devastated him. Since he was lost in his sorrow, he was barely able to focus on guild activities, and chose to quit as a result. He was unable to really participate in his state of mind. Unlike most who descend into poor habits such as alcoholism, he instead chose to stave off his grief by occupying himself with other hobbies and activities to avoid the grim reality. This is what led to the state of his house, as he absorbed himself in the act of organizing to avoid thinking about what had happened. This had gone on for quite a long time before he was able to accept it. And even now he still felt sorrow that he would most likely spend the rest of his life alone once more. Nowadays it felt like he was just moving through life, and just going through the motions. What's there to do this time? He lazily connected to his VR set and flipped through the many different channels. Of course, nothing ever caught his eye, it was more out of habit, or routine at this point. Really nothing on would be something he wanted to listen to. All the news reported nowadays was tragedies and news on the megacorporations. Yet he continued to flip through the various different sections of his set to find anything that he may be able to distract himself with for the rest of the day. Same old same ol, huh? Yggdrasil, despite being shut down quite a while ago, and thus being taken off the market, it was clearly sitting right in front of him. Its icon staring him in the face. Could this be the rumored Yggdrasil 2 that people were talking about? Would they really just release it with no news whatsoever? He thought about the matter for a moment, before concluding his thoughts with a definitive, absolutely. The devs of that game were known for pulling stuff all the time, so this would hardly be unordinary. Well, it's something to do. Maybe I'll be able to see everyone from Ainz again. Though thinking about it, it's probably quite unlikely. Even so, he had made his decision. With a quiet tap of his console, he prepared to start what would no doubt be the start of another exciting adventure just as the first had been. And as he did, his vision became swallowed by blackness. What the hell? As he woke from his daze, those were the only words he could use to describe his current predicament. Instead of being anywhere familiar, such as Yggdrasil's initial spawn point, or even the Great Tomb of Nazareth for that matter, he was in what appeared to be in a simple room. Said space was rather lackluster, and resembled what one may imagine the interior of a castle in medieval times to look like. It appeared to be a living space, as there was a dresser, a mirror, and a couch within it. There was no light source in the room, which left most of it darkened. It was only through the gentle moonlight that fluttered in through the window that illuminated what little was there. Looking through it revealed many buildings similar to what he was in, but at first glance, nothing important could be gleaned from them. There was also 2 doors on either side of the room. Though not exquisite in make, they were still quite pleasing to look at, and had the passage of time not worn them down, they clearly would cost a fair price. Presumably they would just lead to other sections of the hose. However, if people did live here once, it was plain to see that they were no longer here. Everything in the room was caked in a thick layer of dust that seemed to give everything in the domain an almost muted coloring, to the point that it was almost white. Even the wooden flooring appeared to have a carpet over it from how much grit had accumulated. This is odd? I would have thought that at the start would be a bit more streamlined. Like how back in the first game, you would be given a cutscene to give the explanation on the plot, then go from there. Yet now I've just been thrown into the thick of it. Or could this be a pre-game prologue? The idea was not too outlandish when he thought about it in those terms. Perhaps this was just a tutorial that would go through the story as you explored a ruined castle. It did seem to fit the bill of the explore the unknown motif the devs constantly tried to cram down the throats of those who played. Well, it's certainly a fun way to tell a story. Having you sift through the aftermath of whatever happened to give it more life is something I'm willing to get behind. Though where to start? From the look of things, the room he was in did not have anything worth noting. Though the devs of Yggdrasil were well known for their sadism and hiding things, they still kept it fair for the most part. They would not hide something in front of a new player in the spawn area. Especially not if this was just an interactive story. The only thing noteworthy was the 2 doors, which appeared to be his only sensible option at the moment. Knowing them, one of them probably leads to a death trap just for laughs. No, that's almost certainly the case. One had to assume the worst in Yggdrasil, or things would go south very quickly. If you thought something was a trick or a trap, 9 times out of 10, you'd be correct. Humph, he made a noise to signify his acceptance of the challenge, as well as psyche himself up, and strode forth to the door on his right. Yet instead of finding a pathway to his goal, or even an NPC to explain something to him, what he found defied all of his expectations. It was a bathroom. In hindsight, it would be relatively obvious to most, but it was simply so obvious he had failed to account for the fact that it may not even be a trap at all. Ha! Well, that took the wind right out of my sail, cough cough. Unsurprisingly, when one moves around in a room filled to the brim with grime and dirt, it's only natural that one would inevitably begin to cough due to the accumulation. But this seemingly normal fact of life was anything but normal in this situation. How the hell was I able to cough? This is all virtual, isn't it? Stimulus like that shouldn't even exist. The instant this thought hit him, he immediately switched his mental state from one of curiosity to one of panic. A feeling that should have been completely impossible to replicate by virtual means had just occurred. But how could, while he was looking the ground in confusion, another completely unforeseen event had developed. And almost have spurred on by his new state of mind, he noticed something that should have been self-evident. His hands were not that of a human's. Though in a game that would hardly be strange, he was startled for a completely different reason. The fact that they were so familiar to him was the truly startling thing. Without hesitation, he moved to the mirror in the room he had spotted previously, and threw the dust of at alarming speeds. While this resulted in another bout of coughing, he did not care and choose to focus on his new form. Though only lightly illuminated through the moon's glow, he could make out most of his features. His skin was a very deep blue, almost appearing to be gray, with formless pale white markings on the arms and chest that gave off the appearance of tribal tattoos. And upon closer inspection, there were small seams near his chest area, which gave his skin a almost chitin-like appearance. His face was quite similar to that of a elf's, with long ears and beautiful features. His pure white hair was formed into a funnel-like shape, and gave it the appearance of silk. Though he was now in a body that was completely foreign to him, the name of his species was readily apparent to him. He was a Arachne. Arachnes were one of the few heteromorphic races that had a fairly normal body compared to the others. They were often mistaken for elves due to their long ears, and according to the game's lore, they would use this to their advantage to lure in unsuspecting people away, only to devour them in their nest. Some players even used their appearance to avoid the various PK hunters that preyed on heteromorphs by using this technique. Their base stats were fairly low for a heteromorph, and the only thing that was worth noting was their higher than average agility, so they weren't very popular. However, to compensate for this, they could adopt a more monstrous form once per day once a certain level was reached, which far outstripped other creatures in strength, as well as gaining special abilities that were unique to it. The racial skills they could use were not too different from other insectoid races, and the extremely similar arachnid race was generally considered to be better due to their more even stat spread. Yet the few players that were able to find a niche for them tended to play in very similar ways. Though most players tended to say the drawbacks were not worth the advantages, they could still be used quite well on a smart player who knew how to use their abilities. One of them being Genjiro. Though he could accurately guess the species of his new body, it was not comforting to him in the least, as the reason he could so easily guess it was simple. This was his avatar back when he first played Yggdrasil. Though he lacked his gear, and only possessed a thin pair of brown leather pants, the game's form of censorship, it was clearly the same being he had played as years back. Bearing witness to this, as well as the sensations he had previously felt, a thought ran through his head. A completely ludicrous idea that he was trying his best to ignore. A voice that was saying to him, "What if this isn't a game? Impossible." Such a thing was naturally not something that could happen in this world. It was only used for storytelling and nothing more. Fiction, in other words. He couldn't have possibly been summoned to a brand new world, could he? This must be a dream, right? Oh, extremely realistic dream, but a dream nonetheless. He attempted to console himself by coming up with possible scenarios for his situation, but the more he stood there in silence, the more his fear and uncertainty grew, causing him to panic even further. This doesn't make any sense. How is this possible? How could this have happened? His panic over this unexpected situation was causing him to repeat himself, almost as a coping mechanism, as if explaining how strange the scenario was would somehow fix things. Okay. I just need to calm down. Breath. Mindlessly panicking like this would not end well in the future. If he wanted any hope of understanding, and therefore, fixing this, he would need to have a clear state of mind. After allowing his predicament to settle into his mind, he finally allowed himself some tranquility, however brief. Now was not the time to fall into fear. If I really am in another world, then the first thing I need is information. But what should I? Despite all the shock he had been receiving over the course of the last minute, the most unexpected thing yet just occurred. The sound of a doorknob turning could be keenly heard. And with it, a thrill of terror that ran through his body which refused to vanish. In his bout of hysteria, he had completely disregarded the fact that he may not be alone. Though it seemed unlikely, it was still possible. Right now, he was completely defenseless, unaware of his location, situation, and his current abilities. And now an unknown entity was about to appear. His brain entered a fight or flight state, and in the 1 second he had to decide, he chose the latter, and in his attempt to hide, subconsciously activated a skill. His body blended into the shadow of the walls, rendering himself completely invisible to the naked eye. Did I just use a skill? Genjiro had built his character to be a rouge cum trapper who specialized in area denial and movement penalty. His was essentially someone who would plant traps for victims to become immobilized and debuffed by, and then his team would finish of the weakened opponent. The fact that he seemed to still possess his repertoire of skills as a LV-100 was a small comfort, but still did not alleviate his worries. No matter how powerful one built their character to be, they would be essentially useless without gear to supplement their build. Never mind level 100, even a level 70 creature could likely defeat him if it was combat-oriented. Still, he lied in wait as the door slowly opened. It would appear whoever was appearing was just as cautious as him. Yet, when the entrance was fully agape, the figure was now completely visible. It was humanoid in appearance, and if looks were any indication, she was a female. She had long blonde hair which was curled in several places, giving a very distinct look that gave of a feeling of nobility. Her sharp eyes glowed with an emerald sheen, made all the more beautiful in the moon's light, and despite her fair features, her face was filled with vigilance, carefully watching her surroundings, with one hand constantly on the hilt of the greatsword on her back. She was very clearly a warrior. Her equipment seemed to be quite well made, if not, a bit bland compared to most high-end ones, but he did not have the appropriate class to appraise it from this distance, and could only guess at her abilities based on her mannerisms. Well, since I'm hidden like this, she shouldn't be able to detect me. Though this is a fairly low-level skill, it would take at least a level 50 divination specialist to find me as I am now. Without warning, she adopted a fighting stance that made use of her weapon's length, that almost made it double as a shield, and shouted out into the empty air, "I know someone is here, so show yourself now. Before I destroy this entire room." Not good. Though he was unclear on how she managed to detect his presence, it was now evident that hiding was not going to work. He had very little time to weigh his options, and seeing the predicament he was in, it may be better to comply with her demands. After deactivating his skill, he slowly strode from his position, causing her to instantly pivot toward him, her eyes full of suspicion and panic. "What? Who are you? What are you doing here?" "I could ask you the same thing. I was under the impression that this place was abandoned. But before that, how did you find me? I'm quite adept at sneaking, and you don't look like a seeker, nor did you cast a spell, so what technique did you use?" he asked, not only because he was curious, but the question also served to de-escalate the tense situation. "I could hear noises from a distance, and when I got here there were footprints lying around in the dust. But you didn't answer my question. What are you doing here?" Her eyes did not leave him for a single second. It would seem she was still quite suspicious of him. "Look, I promise I'm not here to harm you or anything, I just got lost and found myself here. If you want me to leave I will, but could you at least point me towards the nearest city?" She squinted her eyes towards him, presumably attempting to see through any lies that were reflected in his face. Though after some time, her eyes lost some of the power that was put into them, and she seemed to be lowering her guard somewhat. "Are you an elf? How did you manage to make it this far south? Was it because you were running from the theocracy?" He gave thanks in his heart for this heaven-sent question. Now he had a motive for being here, though his reason for that motive was still unknown to him. Indeed. I had lost my way at some point and found myself here, so I was just looking around to find anything useful. I see. After a small period of introspection on her part, it would seem she was willing to let down her guard as she finally sheathed her weapon. Well then, I apologize for trying to attack you, but you really caught me by surprise. Your skills in stealth seem to be quite impressive. Did you learn them in the Elven Forest by chance? As I understand it, you elves are especially skilled when it comes to guerrilla tactics. Well, not exactly. I learned my methods on my own, but you're not exactly wrong. Lie after lie flew through his teeth in order to draw suspicion off of him. He could only hope this would not come back to bite him later on. Since he had finally gotten her to at least regard him as a non-threat, he decided to ask a question that he had been curious about since he had first seen her. By the way, I've been meaning to ask this, but are you a player? Huh, her face was the very picture of confusion. Bearing witness to this, he could reasonably assume that she was not. However, this brought more questions than it answered. But he would have to leave that for later. Never mind. I can see by your reaction that you aren't. No need to worry yourself over it, though he could see she was clearly still confused. She would most likely not understand even if he were to explain it. Is anyone else here, by the way? It seems strange for there to be only one person here. Upon hearing this seemingly normal question, her face seemed to take on a strange expression he couldn't quite place, as there was too many emotions within it to accurately place. Yet after a prolonged period of silence, she finally responded with a yes, with a voice that seemed to have been squeezed out. If you would like to meet them, I can take you there. They may be able to point you in the right direction. Wonderful. By the way, I don't believe we formally introduced ourselves. My name is Genjiro. It's a pleasure. Likewise. I'm Locuse Alvian Dale Aindra. Within the crumbled and cracked city, the crackling of a campfire was the only sound that was heard in the deep and silent night that loomed over it. For friends surrounded the blaze, but no one spoke. The mood in the air was very solemn, and no one knew what to say. All four belonged to one of the kingdom's two adamantite-ranked adventurers. They were known as Blue Rose, and occupied what many considered to be the pinnacle of human ability. Those who had come the closest to stepping into the domain of heroes. Humanity's crowning jewels. Despite their prestige, they were still human. And thus there were many things even they could not do. Which is why when the Sorcerer Kingdom declared war on the kingdom, they choose to flee for their lives. While some may consider this cowardly, no one would chastise them for this decision. The Sorcerer King's infamous reputation was known to most of the known world now, and those who did not still had second-hand reports of his actions. Anyone facing the same choice would surely have done the same. Only an absolute fool would choose to do battle with such a being. Unfortunately, one such fool belonged to their team. The gallant leader of Blue Rose, Locuse Alvian Dale Aindra. Though they all possessed some semblance of attachment to the kingdom, as it was their home nation, they all knew it was not long for this world. With both the kingdom's dark underbelly of crime and corruption, and hostile foreign powers at every step of the way. Though they could help fight off the symptoms, the disease had already spread its roots throughout the kingdom. Yet despite this, Locuse was unyielding in her determination. Both to protect the kingdom's citizens, and to her friend Renner. Even if all it amounted to was a single second of time. Since they were unable to persuade her from standing down, they had to resort to more rough methods. Though it was done in kindness, and she knew this as well, she still held on to the guilt of abandoning her friend. And the blame for that landed squarely on her companions. So they weren't on the best of terms right now. And so they had no choice but to wait it out. Though they remained in quiet solace for the most part, as the events that had occurred left everyone distressed. Not only because of the kingdom's destruction, but due to the fact that the Sorcerer Kingdom had now grown even larger. It seemed to be a monster that had awakened, and was now spreading its tendrils throughout the world, grasping onto nation after nation. None of them could bring themselves to engage in casual conversation with such a threat looming over them. Yet the fact they could not do anything in the face of it only heightened their despair. Oi, Evil Eye! Though Gagarin was the first to break the silence, the mood was not absolved, as Evil Eye simply slowly turned her head to face her, without saying a word. Will Lockhughes really be alright? Well, knowing her personality, she will be, but it will likely take some time. She's stubborn, and she'll have to be the one to make the first move before we can continue moving forward. Though there is no telling how long that will take. What is our next move anyway? No one here questioned what happened to the kingdom. Even if they were not there, all of them knew who was the victor. The only question that remained is the fate of the kingdom after the fact. Though based on their path of destruction, their survival was slim. No, even those odds were likely far too naive. They likely had been completely wiped out. But now that the kingdom was gone, they had no real set path. While revenge was a tempting option, they could not do so at their current level. While I'd like to discuss it in detail when Lockhughes finally decides to show, but right now, I'm planning something with that granny. I had used message to let her know the situation, and we are currently planning a way to defeat the Sorcerer Kingdom. Looks of utter stupefaction appeared on everyone else present at these words. Is that something that's even possible? If her words are to be believed, then it is. But like I said, I'll go into more detail once Lockhughes arrives. That way we can set out immediately. Even I don't know the full story yet, only the basics. I see. And just like that, the conversation was over. This was how it had been ever since they had arrived here. Whenever they did engage in a discussion, it never lasted more than a few sentences before fizzling out completely and resuming the stagnant air that this place had possessed for the many centuries since its fall. After another period of silence, it was Tia's turn to break the silence. Evil Eye, are you sure the Sorcerer King's forces won't be able to find us here? Positive. For one, I doubt someone as powerful as him even cares what we're up to. He may not even know we exist yet, so I doubt we have anyone trailing us. And two, this place has been abandoned for centuries. Not many people even know of its existence. The capital of Inveria, right? Just so. Though some of you may remember, this was also my home. Ah, you did mention something like that a while back. If I'm not mistaken, you also said this was where you became a vampire. If you don't mind me asking, how did that happen? No response. Sorry, I guess I pried a bit too deep there. It's fine. Just a bitter memory. Hey, isn't that Lockhughes over there? The team turned to follow. Lockhughes, before you. Watch out. All four of them got into a fighting stance, weapons drawn at the ready. Standing behind their comrade was someone who they had never seen before. At first glance, he seemed to be some species of elf. Though it was hard to tell which, as he had various traits which seemed to be at odds with one another, making pinning his species down a very difficult task. He had a slender, yet muscular body, similar to wood elves, but his almost gray skin belonged to dark elves. His hair was a pure white, a trait extremely rare for elves in general, and his body was covered in various symbols and markings, which was only present in the rare fae. Nothing about him seemed to make sense. Though to them this was secondary. Whoever he was, they needed to protect their friend. Before they could lunge out to attack, however, Lockhughes held her hand out, telling them to stop. It's all right, everyone. He's with me. Confused looks were evident on all of their faces, but it was soon replaced with suspicion as questions popped up regarding his identity. And he is? Gagarin did not intend to hide this fact, as she still held her weapon as she asked for it. A elf who was running from the theocracy. He was taking refuge in the castle and we bumped into one another. Is that so? Oi, what's your name, stranger? Evil Eye's response proved that Gagarin's earlier response was not just hurrah, but were mutual among her comrades. Or rather, in this case, Lockhughes' response was the strange one for not being on guard against a complete stranger. Genjiro. That doesn't sound like a elven name, nor have I heard it used in general. The group's gaze grew even more suspicious. Lacuse, don't you think he could be a spy working for the Sorcerer King? Should we not tie up any loose ends here? Surprisingly, she did not instantly refute those words, but instead chose to think in silence. From that they could surmise that she was also wary of him. Though after a brief period of time had passed, she simply shook her head. No, it's highly unlikely that is the case. If he really was from the Sorcerer Kingdom, then he would at least have some equipment that was ideal for sneaking, correct? He said he was running from the theocracy, so I'd say that lines up. What he's wearing is fairly standard with the rags they make elves wear there. Her voice became laced with anger as she finished her last sentence. Are you certain, Lacuse? If you're wrong, it could be disastrous for us in the future. What if he runs off and lets him know our current location? What would we do if we suddenly have an army knocking on our door? A quiet "I'm right here" could be heard after the fact, but they chose to ignore it. Why would the Sorcerer King even be after us, Evil Eye? We haven't done anything to him yet? I'll admit it's strange for him to appear out of the blue, but it isn't the hardest thing to believe, is it? Do you truly have any proof that he is working for him? Because I am not going to attack a random passerby on a hunch. Her words were said with ironclad finality. Truly, she lived up to her title, noblest out of the five. Well, for starters, his strength. All of you may not be as well attuned as me, but I can get a general sense of an opponent's strength, and when I imagine attacking you, my instincts go into overdrive. And as we know, the Sorcerer Kingdom is filled with unimaginably powerful beings. While I appreciate being called strong, I gained my strength on my own, you know? I don't know how simply being somewhat strong affiliates me with this so-called Sorcerer Kingdom. I've never even heard of it until today. It was Genjiro's turn to ask a question, as he had been under fire without much of a chance to defend himself. It doesn't, but the fact that you came out of nowhere with such powers is quite suspicious. I find it hard to believe that you have no affiliation with them because of that fact. Do you think he could be a child of that sex-crazed tyrant? Tina responded to Evil Eye's question with a question of her own. If that was the source of his power, it would explain much. Ah, him. The person in question was known as the Elf King. While little was known about him as he tended to live a reclusive lifestyle in an already seldom traveled to kingdom, the one thing everyone knew about him was his lust. Whether they were elves who had escaped the theocracy, the ones that remained as prisoners, that one detail remained consistent with all of the females. They said that he would breed with any woman he could get his hands on in the hopes of siring a child that would gain his powers. In fact, it was so excessive to the point where non-virgins in the kingdom were more rare to find than pure ones. Though it was not known on whether his power was truly as powerful as the rumors suggest, the fact that he could rein his citizens in with fear of his wrath gave him some credibility at least. All of this combined gave him a reputation around the world as a cruel tyrant. The theocracy in particular were waged in a seemingly endless war with them, with conscripts that the king forced into battle. No, if that were the case he would have heterochromatic eyes. Likely he just had an innate talent like some others have and refined it to a high level. Besides, the elves all say none of his children have awakened his power yet, so I doubt that's the case anyway. I see. And even if we choose to disregard your abnormal strength, your name also falls under suspicion. From the intel we've gathered, the Sorcerer Kingdom's officials seem to have names that I've never heard in use, nor do they show up in any sort of history or ancient text. Before the fall of the kingdom, the group had been doing their own research out of their own moral obligation to save the people there. Though everything they learned about the kingdom was shocking, namely the way the citizens were treated, the subject of names had been addressed. However, it fell to the wayside, as the other matters took more precedence. For example, there is Albedo, the Sorcerer Kingdom's Prime Minister. Though the fact that she only has one name despite her rank is strange, the name itself has never been used by any species until now. And even then, there is the Sorcerer King himself. Though it is true intelligent undead often grant themselves names at their genesis, they often have some sort of relation to death or some aspect they associate with. In contrast, the name Ainz has seemingly no meaning whatsoever. A twitch. It was only a small movement, but they immediately spotted it due to them all being on guard. His entire body froze, and his face seized up with some unknown emotion. Was it shock? Excitement? Or maybe even wonder? Perhaps it was all of the above. Oya? I thought you said you didn't know of the Sorcerer King's existence? So what's with that reaction? Though it was clear from her tone and the mood that she was attempting to attack his previous statement, he did not seem to care. It didn't even seem like he noticed, almost like he was in his own world. I don't have any, I think I've heard, could it be? Various different sentences formed and disappeared as he jumped from one answer to the next. Though this may be seen as proof he was lying, they could tell there was more to it than that. His response was far too emotional. Once he seemingly collected his thoughts, he turned to Evil Eye, and with no hesitation, asked, "How can I get to the Sorcerer Kingdom?" "I've got a bad feeling about this Locuse." Though everyone had vehemently denied his request at first, it was apparent he was not going to take no for an answer. Despite the fact that he seemingly knew nothing, his eyes were full of conviction, and he would clearly not be dissuaded. Eventually, after discussing it with each other, they agreed to under the pretext that his actions were not lining up with that of a spy if he was one, but they still were left worried at the prospect of letting such a dangerous person go there with information on them. Yet in response to Evil Eye's foreboding, she simply stared in silence in the direction he had left. The lack of reassurance from her did little to dispel the team's unease. Truth be told, there were still many unanswered questions on his origins to even his character, but choosing to attack him to prevent secrets from getting out was out of the question. Even if problems propped up because of this, they would simply have to deal with it when the time came. Well, it's not like it matters at this point. What's done is done. What we need to be focusing on right now is what comes next. Locuse. I realize you may not have completely forgiven us yet, but right now isn't the time to be quarreling. We need to deal with the major problem in front of us before we can move on to the smaller ones. We need to work together to have any chance at winning. Besides, don't you think the best way to repay Renner for her kindness is to avenge her? Twitch. Hearing her casually bring up her lost friend of old as a means to persuade her gave rise to feelings of anger, but she quashed them as quickly as they came. As much as she didn't want to admit it, in this situation, she was right. Right now she had to focus on the bigger picture. And avenging Renner was honestly one of her main goals at the moment. Sigh, fine. I'll let it go for now until this mess has been sorted. So, what's the plan? Well, before that. She reached into her cloak and seemingly activated some sort of item, as the ambience of the world around them seemed to dull and faded even further into the background. It's just a precaution. No explanation was needed on what, or rather who, she was on guard about. As of right now, I don't know yet. Rigrid contacted us so we could create one together. I can already tell what you're thinking, and normally I would agree. It's true we don't have the power to defeat him. I may be able to handle some of his summons, but defeating the Sorcerer King himself is going to require an immeasurably powerful being. Where are you going with this, Evil Eye? While we may not be able to stop him, that Granny said she is currently working with the Platinum Dragon Lord. If we can get him on our side, then there is no way we could lose. The shock was clearly visible on everyone's face. The Platinum Dragon Lord was considered by those who knew of his existence to be the most powerful being in the world. The idea of having him as an ally surely gave rise to their hopes, and gave them the slightest glimmer of a victory. That's amazing. But can he really defeat the Sorcerer King? Gagarin's question was a fair one. Though they knew he was strong, exactly how strong remained to be seen. While the Sorcerer King made his power known through the land by demonstrating his might to the entire world. In contrast, the Platinum Dragon Lord only had his reputation of being the strongest, as well as his species being the strongest race in the New World. Though dragons were strong, other sufficiently powerful beings or adventures could defeat them in combat. Though comparing that which stood at the top of the world to a regular dragon was most likely quite rude. While I don't know how powerful he is compared to him, it's most likely futile to try to. They both are in a realm beyond our comprehension. His power feels similar to Jaldabaoth when he showed up before us. Besides, Rigrid seemed quite confident, so they must have something up their sleeves, right? I guess that makes sense. Alright. I'm getting excited now that we may actually have a chance to turn the tables on that bastard. Exactly. But we have to remember that it's only a chance. That's why we can't waste this opportunity. So we need to set off to meet up with them as soon as possible and learn what needs to be done. Where are we going this time? The council state? The exact opposite, actually. We'll be heading to the city of Ainz. Ainz ul Gaun? Those 3 words were the only thing on his mind right now. Logically speaking, he should have never heard that name again. Yet what should have been completely impossible was now somehow a reality. While it could have been mere coincidence, the name was too specific for that to be the case. Ultimately, he knew nothing. He was suddenly thrust into a completely unfamiliar world with no idea on where he was or how he got here. Even in the best-case scenario, he would be in Yggdrasil, but that posed problems in its own right, as the dangers that were present in the 9 realms were not something he could feasibly survive in. But even if that is the case, this is my best shot at surviving. If the name Ainz ul Gaun exists here, then that must mean my guildmates are to right? That wasn't too outlandish of an idea. After all, he had been forcibly pulled into another world by forces beyond his comprehension. Being transported here at all seemed to be a stranger idea than that. Even if it's not them, I can likely still find out whatever caused me to be dragged here in the first place. No matter how you look at it, this is my best option. Though it may be a perilous journey, he had no choice in the matter. If he ever had any hope of figuring out the truth, it would be in the sorcerer kingdom of Ainz ul Gaun. And though he only had a general idea of what direction it was, it shouldn't be too hard to find. All he would need to do is ask travelers on his way there. No time like the present then. Ainz. 500 years ago, this city was said to be the capital of the 8 Greed Kings, and is one of the few remaining pieces of evidence to suggest they ever existed. Though that question was still debated upon to this day, this city's existence is often the main reason why the myths haven't been completely dismissed as false. Both from a logically and magical standpoint, this city's very existence seemed impossible. Despite the fact that it exists within an extremely inhospitable desert that was filled with all manner of monsters, the city flourished with life, not hindered in the slightest by these issues. The sole cause of that is the barrier of magic that surrounds the city's perimeter. Not only does it keep the scorching heat of the wasteland at bay, but it also acts as an illusion, which causes anything viewing it to simply see nothing but a plain of sand. And even if some beast manages to stumble its way into its walls, 30 armed golems stand at the ready, each possessing weapons beyond mortal comprehension. When looking at both the military might of its centurion army, and the shield of magic that surrounds the city, it was plain to see why such a city would be seen as proof of their existence. No magic to date, not even the most powerful, could even approach such a feat, but this alone was not the city's only wonder. The haven of the kings, their floating castle in the sky, poured an endless stream of fresh water for the populace down below, and magic items within its walls could produce food in exchange for materials, which gave them all they needed to survive. Though many wondered at what treasures could be within the domicile of the beings that reigned over the world, it was impossible to reach. Not only was its height an issue for anyone who did not possess flying magic, but even those that did could not breach the walls of the castle. Either their mana would not last the trip, or they would be told to leave by a platinum-clad knight, and so to date, no one knew what lay within. Even teleportation magic was disabled. The city's culture was also unlike the rest of the world. They possessed a myriad of strange weapons and clothing that only the city knew how to produce, such as katanas. Though they were simple weapons in design, they were rather formidable in battle. They were stronger than the average magic weapon and possessed formidable sharpness, which naturally caused it to possess an equally formidable price. And though the population does consist of those who travel to the city on their own pilgrimage, most of the population were descendants from the city's first inhabitants, so certain traits, such as black hair, are common among them, and are often used to identify those that live there. All of this made those who heard stories of the city's grandeur hope to venture out to it one day and live the rest of their lives in luxury. A reward for those willing to risk everything and trek into the wild to face dangers to obtain. And because of this, those that managed to make it to the city rarely returned. Either because they found what they wished, or it was too much of a hassle to leave. Despite all of these wonders, however, there is a reason why it is seldom traveled to. Disregarding the dangers in trekking across the desert to find a hidden city, there was a larger issue for most people. Those who worshipped the 6 great gods saw this city as a monument to the beings that destroyed them. Thus they would not associate with the city in any capacity. In fact, if it were not for the looming threat of the golems, the slain theocracy would have razed the city to the ground long ago. Therefore the city was often referred to as a dirty paradise. A refuge for those who had abandoned the gods in exchange for pleasure in the mortal plane. Which was why a group of people who were walking through the city streets were receiving many strange looks and glances. They numbered 10 in all, and other than the fact that they appeared to be guarding 2 of the individuals in the diamond formation. Though this drew some suspicious gazes, the truly strange thing was their outfits, or to be more precise, what was on them. As all of them bore the symbol of the slain theocracy. While I understand we agreed to talk with it since the stakes are so high, it still disgusts me to have to walk through this city of fools who would rather waste their lives indulging in pleasure than give faith to our gods. The currently outraged man, Raymond, began to vent his frustrations to his comrade. Though they were on a mission to save humanity, they could not escape the anger that boiled up inside of them from being in a city that disregarded their very reason for their existence. I understand your feelings well, Raymond, but we have no choice. Besides, we would never be allowed within the Council State's borders, nor do we want to be, so at the very least we should be thankful we are still in a human nation. If they would have had to step within that nation of savages to plead their case, he would not have even considered asking him for help at all. Still, asking assistance from him of all people. I hope you know what you're doing, Pontifex. Upon hearing his friend's worry, his thoughts began to drift back to the day he brought up the suggestion of siding with the dragon in question. I have decided that in order to avoid the possibility of failure, however slight, we should request assistance from the Platinum Dragon Lord. A uproar. What else was to be expected when bringing up such a ludicrous statement? The slain theocracy prided itself as the saviors of humanity, carrying out the legacy their gods began. Therefore asking help from another species, not to mention one of rulers of their country's antithesis, was truly out of line. Have you lost your damn mind, Pontifex? From the likes of them. Surely that's not necessary. That overgrown lizard. The group's demeanor was completely unlike their usual behavior, which just showed the extent of their shock and wrath. The normally calm and composed cardinals began grinding their teeth in anger, trying and failing to keep their anger in check. Well, it's not as if I don't feel the same way. He thought to himself. The theocracy could be considered a perfect nation in various ways, such as their religious and governmental institutions being closely linked, having the undisputed strongest military force in the surrounding human nations, and so on. However, the theocracy's problems lay with their merciless way of dealing with issues. Their practice of human supremacy that they would so often preach about had helped it become what it is today, that much was true. However, this also became a fatal flaw to them over time. Their ruthless nature combined with their almost cultish slavery to the gods had given them tunnel vision that caused their emotion to cloud their judgment. Though not everyone shared this flaw, it was quite common among the masses, and even the heads of the state were not immune, thus they often fell into emotional outbursts whenever certain topics came up. While I understand your anger, we can't deny the threat the Sorcerer King faces. Let me say this as matter-of-factly as I can. If we lose, humanity is doomed. And though the Godkin will most likely win, I wish to avoid even the faintest hint of defeat. Even if it means working with him. Though I am unable to make this decision by myself. So though I most likely already know what you're thinking, I still wish to hear your opinions on this. Berenice was the first to speak her mind on the matter. While I understand your concerns, don't you feel like your lack of confidence could be seen as lacking faith that the gods' artifacts and power are not enough? I personally feel that as long as we hold on to our faith, nothing can go wrong. Though her smile and presence were warm, and often made him feel at ease, it was having the exact opposite effect on him this time. Jinadine? I am in firm agreement with Berenice. Now is not the time to lose faith, nor question whether we can. The gods' panoply have never failed us, and we possess weapons and abilities beyond the imagining of that damn undead. Due to his age, he tended to be more stubborn on his beliefs, as he was under the mindset that he had figured everything out already. Though in this case, he was not alone, as the two remaining cardinals nodded their heads along with his statement. Now is exactly the time to be questioning that. While I have no doubt that the gods' weapons and powers can slay the undead and whomever follows it, the amount of opponents has me on edge. Not to mention he may have a trump card hidden up its sleeve. I do not wish for us to fail at the last moment from something we did not expect. So we should prepare an ace in the hole just in case. The room went silent as everyone entered a state of deep thought. Though good points were made, they could not help but feel like even questioning the effectiveness of the gods' power was disloyal. How could they make any headway with this discussion if any doubt was seen as treachery against their faith? Raymond, how do you feel about this? You've remained silent this entire time? Do you also agree that we should attempt to receive aid from the Dragon Lord? On the contrary, I actually agree with the Pontifex's assessment. That single statement almost shocked the room as much as the initial query had. Even the Pontifex was stunned, as he had expected unanimous opposition. I have been thinking about this for some time now, but defeating the Sorcerer Kingdom may be nigh impossible to begin with. Though I also have a great deal of faith, I can't help but think rationally. Even if we deploy all we have at that kingdom, we may only be eking out a victory by the skin of our teeth. And we would still need to worry about other nations while we repair during that time as well. While I would rather not have to rely on the power of another nation, much less a non-human one, we are out of options. Doing nothing but waiting will only increase our chances of failure. The Pontifex felt some relief that he was not alone in his assessment. Though he had planned to persuade them all from the beginning, having one on his side would certainly help for the future. Now that he had a backer, it would be far easier gaining their trust. Thank you, Raymond, your thoughts are almost the exact same ones as mine. And trust me when I say this, fellow members of the theocracy, I take no pleasure in this. In fact, it disgusts me every time I even think about it. But this is not the time to decide what is faithful and what isn't. We need to take action. If you have any objections, I will listen to them, but I need you to understand, this is no longer something we can just deal with when the time comes. We must strike the first blow in this war, because I fear if the opposite occurs, it may spell our defeat then and there. So I implore you, please, listen to me when I say we need his help. Though his heartfelt plea had turned a few minds, it still took effort to get them all to agree. Eventually a vote was cast, with the Pontifex being excluded, ending in a vote of 4 halves. Which is what led them to their current predicament. Yet even though they had come so far, one thought would not seem to leave his mind. Are we making a huge mistake? This single sentence had clung to the two of them even since they embarked on this trip. Though they had resolved themselves to do so for the sake of humanity, they still found themselves doubting its necessity. He shook his head to clear it of his thoughts. Thinking like that right now was unproductive, and pointless as they had already committed to doing it. If he started doubting his decision now, he would be a hypocrite of the highest order. You said it yourself back then. We are out of options at the moment, and we need to obtain anything that will help us succeed. Even if that means temporarily teaming up with him. I still can't believe it's come to this. I hate it with every fiber of my being. If we make it through this, I may just give up my position of cardinal to the next generation. Going against our faith so harshly is not the mark of a religious head. I might just join you in that path. But enough talk. It seems we're here. While a large portion of the city remained dark from being in the shadow of a giant castle, the very center of the city was almost pitch black. Only the few ring of light surrounding the perimeter shed any radiance within this blackened world. Unlike the rest of the city, the very center was bereft of any infrastructure or buildings, but was a simple, smooth floor. It's speculated that its purpose in the past it was for religious rites, in order to pray to the greed kings, or give offering in their name. And right now the leaders of the most staunchly religious country were standing right in its center. And that thought disgusted them to their cores. Let's get this over with. The Pontifex pulled a small item out from his robe's interior and threw it into the air, causing it to vanish, leaving rippling air in its wake. In truth, it was an item passed down by the gods. One would simply need to input a message into the item, pick a recipient, then when thrown, it would automatically send it to them. It worked very similarly to the message spell, yet had less risk involved, as it was instantaneous. After much study and research, the theocracy could produce the same item, but not very efficiently, and thus were only used for extremely important info that needed to be passed. The message this time, however, was quite simple. It was a simple demand to meet with the Dragon Lord, along with other simple details, such as their current location, and other basic requirements. Now all that's left for is to wait. Since they were already so close, it was not long before they could see a silhouette moving towards them. While the darkness may normally impede this, the composition of their visitor made that a non-issue. Soon enough, a humanoid landed in front of them, clad in platinum armor. It was obvious at a glance how valuable it was, as well as powerful, as it exuded a presence that was unique to the strong. One that would instill a primal fear in the weak. Members of the theocracy, what brings you to my master's abode? Enough with the facade Vazone. We are well aware that you are simply projecting yourself and that ancient weapon of yours. We wish to speak to you directly. Though I know it is sudden, the matter is urgent, and I feel it would be beneficial for us all to drop all pretenses and speak face to face. It took everything Raymond had to hold back his disgust with the being in front of him, though he managed to barely rein himself in to give a somewhat polite response. Barely. Knowing you it must be important, as I doubt you would throw away your pride to speak with one such as I. To be honest, I would have expected all of you to perish before asking my help. Very well. Out of respect for your resolve, I shall grant your wish. Though his remark only served to annoy them further, they could do naught but hold their tongues for now. World teleportation. The group was silent as the surrogate of the Dragon Lord began to walk them through the halls of the castle. Though they belonged to the tyrants of old, they still held a beauty that not much could compare to. If one was unaware of its previous owners, one may even call it divine. Even though they were somewhat enchanted with the architecture, they took no pleasure in being here. The fact that this was once the abode of the Greed Kings made them feel disgusted with themselves for even breathing the same air as them. And the fact that that dragon had chosen this place of all places to be his home only intensified their hatred of him. How the hell can you sit up here in this den of filth, ruling over the scum of the world, and call yourself its savior? The Dragon Lord's self-proclaimed title of the world's protector was quite vain, and was rather insulting to those who prided themselves on protecting their race from the rest of the world. However, these thoughts faded into obscurity as they reached the end of the long hallway, and into an extremely large room. Its dimensions would be rather sizable for any creature, both horizontally and vertically, and could easily fit thousands of people. A large dais at the room's center was a clear focal point, and immediately drew the eye to it, laden with golden framing. It was easily over 10 meters, with only a pearl-white staircase to ascend its imposing height. Everything within seemed to sparkle with light from the moon's glow, which flitted through the large stained glass ceiling that made up the tower's roof. Though they could only guess at what this room was used for, as no clear purpose was evident, it clearly held significant meaning to be this extravagant. The empty shell in the form of a knight motioned the two forward, prompting them to climb the steps to meet with his real body. Seeing no other choice, they complied. Though each step they took felt like they were inching further and further from their ideals, they continued still. The closer they reached to its peak, the more of his body became visible. While everything in the room may have been shining, the light reflecting of the pure platinum scales of the beast was beyond that, and they could feel their eyes begin water from the sheer brightness. Yet they pushed forward and eventually reached the top, and his body was on full display for the two cardinals to behold. Upon seeing his form, their hairs began to stand on end. Though all the cardinals had seen their fair share of battles from their time servicing their nation, and had been on the edge of life and death countless times, they could not help but feel utterly helpless before him. They now stood with what was unquestionably the most powerful being in the world. For all their rage, they were not clueless to the fact that he could erase the theocracy of the face of the earth if he so chose. His massive body began to move, and despite laying on his stomach, his head still towered over both of them. While he may have lowered it to their level as a show of good faith, he had not done so. This was most likely to make the superior/inferior relationship as clear as possible. And he has the gall to call us prideful. He moved his chin upward, as if bidding them to speak. Though he was non-human, and the leader of one of the most hated nations of the slain theocracy, he was still a dragon lord, thus they had to show the proper respect before him. Or at the very least, feign it. So they had to show him their sincerity by praising him. "O great and mighty dragon lord, you honor us with your presence." After saying so, both Raymond and the pontifex knelt before him. "We would like to thank you for taking the time to meet us, and we are extremely grateful that you would listen to our proposal, considering the unfortunate feud between our countries. But we wish to put that aside for the time being to HM." He narrowed his eyes at the two, as if appraising them, though it was impossible to tell what he was thinking, as it was hard to judge the facial expressions of a dragon. It was most likely not contempt or anything similar. The Platinum Dragon Lord, though the theocracy would beg to differ, was a rather benevolent being, and was unlike his brethren who saw themselves as above all other creatures, and would allow discussions to be held to those who sought it. Though this was not to say he didn't think he was superior. "While I understand that you wish to get in my good graces, your country has already shown time and time again you have a strong hatred for the country I have built, and by extension, me. I would ask you to dispense with the meaningless formalities and tell me why you have come here." They did not despair, nor fall into shock upon seeing their plan fall through. They had already predicted this would happen, so they already prepared themselves for that answer. It would have been more surprising to them if that ridiculous display actually worked. Seeing their time for flattery and pretty speech had come to an end, they abandoned their facade and rose from their kneeling positions, barely managing to hide the contempt from their faces. This was no way to treat the ruler of a nation, let alone the lord of all dragons. However, they did so to show they no longer had anything to hide, as it was pointless to hide true feelings when both parties knew exactly how they felt about each other. Though a minor feeling of regret still lingered. "You did say to drop all pretenses for this, did you not?" His taunt only fueled their rage. "Very well then. I'm certain that we don't need to explain why we are here, but for the sake of discussion, I will do so anyways." Raymond took in a deep breath to prepare, and let forth the speech he had been going over for the past few days. "As you are no doubt aware, the Sorcerer King has begun expanding his territory, and in the process destroyed an entire nation of the face of the earth. With every passing day, his strength increases, and as much as we hate to say it, he gains more followers to his nation. Everything has fallen into place for him, and we must stop it as soon as possible, before he grows even stronger. Which is why we have come to you." He took a deep breath, and continued. "Though we possess great military might, even we are worried that it may not be enough in the face of the Sorcerer King's might, both when looking at his nation's armies, and his individual strength. So to ensure that he vanishes from the face of the earth, we have come to request your aid. When the time comes to lay siege on his kingdom, we want to borrow your power, to leave no possible chance of its victory. For one such as you, the Sorcerer King is no issue at all, correct? So we implore you to assist us in taking down this menace. We may not be fond of one another, but we are willing to throw that to the side for now to ask this of you." The two waited with bated breath, awaiting a response to their plea, only to be met with a sigh. "Indeed, I agree with your assessment. The Sorcerer King is a threat to the entire world, and it is troublesome how large his sphere of influence has grown. So yes, I might be persuaded to helping with your plan. However, I would like to ask a favor in turn. Is that necessary? While we may comply with whatever request you have, does the Sorcerer King's presence not take priority? Your country has done nothing but wish death on my people, and incite massacres on all those whom are different from yourselves. So why should I freely give my power to you? Did you think that I would just drop everything to become your secret weapon? So yes, I will ask a favor, as I will not assist you otherwise. The two gulped, deciding in that moment what he might ask and what terms to reject. If you wish for me to help you, then I want your country to stop assaulting the demi-human villages that surround the perimeter of other countries. Why? You can't be serious? Very. Just as you dislike when human settlements are attacked, I find it displeasing to see what are essentially my citizens attacked by your people, especially when you invade countries that are not your own to do so. You said yourself that you are willing to throw aside our hatred in order to focus on the major problem in front of us. Prove it to me by accepting this deal. If you cannot even do that, then I see no reason to help your country. His words were laced with power that allowed for no negotiation. They both tightened their hands so much that their knuckles began to turn white. Yet there was nothing they could do in this situation. So with a voice that sounded like it was forced out of their souls, they had given him an answer. Very well. We will accept your demands to defeat the Sorcerer King. Though they knew the stakes, they could not help but be outraged by such an order. They wanted nothing more to spit in his face and curse him to hell. But they could not. They had come to him because they had no other options. It would be paramount to receiving a life preserver as you drowned, only to throw it away because it was given to you by a murderer. He had them cornered. And they hated that. If that is all, then there is nothing more to discuss. However, I will leave you with a warning. Do not attack the Sorcerer Kingdom straight away. I am also thinking of a plan to defeat him, so do not act until I have given you permission. Understood? They said nothing, only turned away with their head lowered in anger. And as they did, the thought they had plagued them since they left came back stronger than ever. All the while pledging themselves to slay him one day. And in doing so, ensuring humanity's future. After ensuring the cardinals were a far enough distance away, the mighty dragon let out a deep sigh through his nose as the room returned to its tranquil state. Dealing with that country is always so tiresome. I'm sure you'll manage somehow, the sudden reply was made with a youthful voice that was full of energy. Completely at odds with its owner. You can never resist making a jab, can you, Rigrit? Oh come now, I'm sure the strongest being in the world can handle a few jests. Unless those scales are the only tough part about you? I do love these relaxed conversations we have. With the current state of the world, I can so rarely indulge in them. But as much as I would like to believe now is one of those times, we can't at the moment. Tell me, old friend, what do you make of their plea? She simply returned his question with a smile. I'm sure you have the same opinion, TSA. They're fools. Indeed, but dangerous fools. If the theocracy thought logically about things, they would know to look for an opening to attack, such as TSA had, and exploit it. But from what he could gather from their plan, they simply intended to rush him with overwhelming might in one go. Don't they realize that it may prompt the Sorcerer King to use them as a casus belli for his future goals? What if he uses their foolishness to convince other nations to join him? That was the truly troubling part about him. Unlike the previous players, the Sorcerer King was not a show-off. He played smart, and only acted when needed. That made dealing with him much harder. Especially now, since they may even require justification for their attack, now that he had gained supporters. Brains and brawn. How does one best something like that? The answer, of course, was quite simple. He just needed to be even smarter and even stronger. He was confident he could win in his real body now that he knew the Sorcerer King's power, and with the false name and info he had on him, it may yet be possible to win this War of Worlds once more. Before we continue, Rigrit, can I ask if you were able to get into contact with your friends of old? Right now we need as many allies as we can get. Indeed, I have. I sent them a message a few days ago, so they should be here soon enough. Thank you. I have something I require of them. Me must play every card we have available if we want to win and secure our world's future. Indeed. Must we truly deal with such a threat every century or so? I hope one day this cycle ends, and the world returns to what it once was. Yes. The two said nothing more. They both simply held on to that simple wish in their hearts, while staring into the stars above, praying for the world's safety.
That's it for today. Remember to show your support to the creator of this story if you enjoyed it. If you would like more parts of the story to be uploaded, leave a comment and subscribe to get notified when the story continues. Bye-bye for now, and I hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.